for effective leadership, and I have one slide that will speak to that. So the Emotional Quotient Inventory assesses emotional intelligence skills, and it is based on decades of research that supports effective human performance and development. The EQ 360, as the name implies, incorporates a multi-rater assessment. So it measures the same competencies as those of the EQI 2.0, and then combines your perceptions of your EQ with the perceptions of those who know you well and are 360 degrees around you. So what is emotional intelligence? It is a set of emotional and social skills that influences the way we perceive and express ourselves, how we develop and maintain our social relationships, how we cope with challenges, and how we use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. It is not a personality test like the Myers-Briggs, which many folks I'm sure are aware of and probably have taken. The Myers-Briggs measures preference or tendency. Emotional intelligence is part nature, part nurture, and consists of the emotional parts of our brains working together with the cognitive part of our brains. It's also a snapshot in time of our emotional intelligence, and we certainly can continue to develop our emotional intelligence based on the areas that we find in the assessment. So what I'll do now is review the model of EQI 2.0. And I'll start off at the top section on self-perception. And the way I like to describe this model of emotional intelligence, it starts with how we perceive ourselves. And how we perceive ourselves in turn is reflected in how we express ourselves, which then in turn leads to the interpersonal relationships that we build and influences our decision-making capabilities and impacts how we manage stress. And why is it important? Well, it's important because our EI skills are critical for building relationships, resolving team conflicts, solving problems, and leading effectively and building resilience. It will also provide you with an assessment of the areas that you are strong at and with areas where you can continue improving on to strengthen your emotional intelligence. So the report that comes out of this from an individual basis will describe how these EQ competencies and the sub-competencies within each of the competencies work together. And then it also provides suggested strategies for bringing your EQ competencies into balance for greater effectiveness. So if we look at self-perception, the sub-competencies there that are measured is self-regard, how actualized we are, what our emotional self-awareness is. In terms of self-expression, how we emotionally express ourselves, how assertive we are, and how independent we are. From an interpersonal perspective, it measures our interpersonal relationships, the level of empathy we have when we are interacting with individuals, and our social responsibility. And then decision-making includes problem solving. And it's really the quality and the emotions, and not necessarily the quality of problem solving, but the emotional awareness that we bring to the problems we solve. It also measures our reality testing, and then our impulse control. And I'll speak to some examples of this in a couple of slides. With regards to stress management, it measures how flexible, how tolerant we are when it comes to stress, and how optimistic we are. And a little factoid, because this EQI model is based on decades of research. It has been found through the research that, and I need to read my facts to get it straight, that men rate higher than women on these two areas. They rate themselves higher in terms of self-regard and stress tolerance, whereas women rate themselves higher than men in the areas of empathy, interpersonal relationships, and social responsibility. Just something to sort of differentiate there. And if there are any questions, I'm not sure who's monitoring, but we can wait until the end. I'm really interactive, but I'm focusing on my presentation as opposed to the chat at this point. Thanks, Christy. So I felt this was a really good way to take a look at how does low emotional intelligence play out versus high emotional intelligence. And I love my little colorful avatars here. So my red avatar with high emotional intelligence comes across as assertive and ambitious, decisive. Whereas if the avatar had low emotional intelligence, their behaviors would be exhibited as being aggressive, demanding, bossy, etc. My yellow avatar with low emotional intelligence, easily distracted, impulsive, bit of a poor listener. Whereas if the avatar had high emotional intelligence, those behaviors then would show up as being enthusiastic, sociable, charming, and persuasive. Moving on to my green avatar, cool, green, high emotional intelligence. I'm patient, stable, predictable, and I listen well. However, if my emotional intelligence is low, my behaviors are going to be exhibited as being passive, slow, and stubborn. And then my blue avatar, having low emotional intelligence, would be critical, fussy, hard to please. On the flip side, if my emotional intelligence is high, I'm going to be detailed, careful, meticulous, and systematic. So now I'd like to show you how this will play out in a leadership setting. And I'm going to provide something that I'm sure all leaders have heard about when employees leave the organization. We've heard, especially from an HR perspective, people don't leave companies, they leave their managers or their leaders. And I feel that this pictorial describes it well. And I'm going to provide an example. So starting with decision-making on the right-hand side. If my decision-making is as a result of me having low emotional intelligence in problem solving and low impulse control, my decision-making is not going to be of a high quality. On the bottom left-hand corner, with regards to occupational stress, if I have low emotional intelligence relating to flexibility and stress tolerance, I'm not going to be thoughtful around how I'm coming across from a leadership perspective. So my behaviors can create stress for my employees. Those behaviors could also impact my decision-making. So I'm not flexible. I don't have a high level of tolerance for stress. I'm really not interested in what my employees are wanting to share with me around inputs into a decision-making. I don't think through from a quality perspective on how I make decisions, and I'm really impulsive. I just want to make the decision and get on. So using those two as examples, we can see how that can play out in a leadership setting or in any team setting when our emotional intelligence is low. Now, if I have high emotional intelligence, my decision-making will be improved because I will seek input from others. I'm going to take the time to make an informed decision as opposed to being impulsive. That alone is going to make the team feel that their opinions have been heard. So it increases team performance. It would decrease the occupational stress. And then, of course, hopefully also decrease staff turnover. All of that combined shows that my emotional intelligence, if it's high, also increases my leadership ability. And there's something on the right-hand side mentioning increased personal well-being. The EQI 2.0 also has one section that speaks to well-being. That's not specifically assessed, but it's using the competencies that the EQI assesses on to provide a snapshot of one's emotional well-being, how happy we are, and how that impacts other areas of EI. So when can it be utilized? These are a list of all of the areas around emotional intelligence and where it has been very effective. I won't go through all of them. I use it for coaching, and I also use it for coaching in the context of leadership development. We find that that works very well, not necessarily from a performance improvement perspective, but helping people move forward if there are some stumbling blocks or areas in how their leadership is currently at and versus where the organization would like it to be. High potential development, I don't have on here succession planning, but it's used for that as well when organizations have a very formal succession planning process in place. It's how do we take a look at the individuals we've identified as part of the succession planning process, and do they then have the right and the right level of emotional intelligence to get them to the next level. So types of reports and their benefits. There is a leader report, which is what is called for everyone, even if you do it as an individual. It's called the leader because it's leadership of self. The 360 report is self-explanatory. It provides you with a snapshot, as I mentioned at the beginning. The workplace report, I really like working with. One doesn't have to do a 360 in order to create a workplace report. So by that, what that does for an individual, if I have an assessment and then I want to now determine how do I take the information that I have and apply it in my day-to-day workplace. It will, for example, if my problem-solving competency was rated low, my emotional intelligence is low on that scale. It will share with me how that impacts my relationships at work, what kind of behavioral implications that will have. It helps me look at things from a different perspective in terms of how do I define the problem when I'm problem solving, and what do I need to watch out for when I am in meetings with others and we problem solving. The other one that I find where it helps as well is impulse control. If our impulse control is low, obviously we're quick to make rash decisions, and that's not always very helpful from a leadership perspective. So it provides some guidance there as to what to look out for. I know for myself, when I went through this as part of my certification, of course, there were, oh, yes, that's something I forgot about that I need to focus on. And I thought I'm such a well-rounded person, but certain areas still need to be developed. And what is really helpful about this is that the coaching that surrounds the EQI assessment comes from a place of you know yourself best. This is what the report shows. And yes, I have had instances where individuals say, well, I don't agree with what is said there. Well, that is how you answered the question. So maybe next time when we do one, and we can repeat these, obviously, because they're not static, but they're not repeated very soon after having done it the first time round. Think maybe a little bit more carefully about how responding to the questions, because the questions are asked. It's the same question asked in two different ways, depending on where they're working through the report. So sometimes we find when people are too quick to get through it, they may not be answering the question very thoughtfully. A couple of other things before I open that was really just a very high overview. What the report will also do is identify blind spots. And in addition to providing guidance on impact at work and strategies for action, I found it interesting when folks said, wow, I didn't realize that that is how I show up. And more so when a 360 is completed. Is that really how people view me? Yeah, I thought I was being assertive as an example. Well, my team thinks that I'm being aggressive. So I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I know that was a really quick overview. I hope that there were some nuggets of information that was shared with everyone. And Christy, is anyone watching the chat line perhaps?
I've got no questions in the chat right now, but I've got a couple.
Oh, sure.
Maybe get us started.
Yeah.
So, and actually, can we go back to your slide where you had your cute little avatars with the high and low emotional intelligence? That one there.
Mm-hmm.
So is there some kind of like a self-assessment tool that or questionnaire that one could go through to figure out where how you're being perceived and where you fit on the emotional intelligence scale?
Yes, thank you.
Because I look at this and I'm like, oh, I wonder which one people perceive me as.
Yes, so there is, if you don't mind, I can quickly share a sample of a report if everyone's interested.
Sure.
So let me get out of this one, yeah? I'll just minimize that. So yes, there is an assessment that everyone will go through. And let me just see where I can bring this up. It's something I can share because it was part of the training, so it's not confidential.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, I just think from a self-awareness perspective, it would be neat to have sort of a tool where I could, go through and just identify some of those, those areas where maybe I'm being perceived differently than I want to.
Yes. Can you see the screen there still?
Yep.
Okay. This is the workplace report, but it is modeled on the assessment. So there's a front page that just speaks to how you have responded to the assessment. This is the same regardless of the report, be it your personal report or if it's a 360, and in this case, it is the workplace report. But you'll immediately see an overview of your results. Pardon me, the total EI for this individual is 98. This doesn't show the bar, but the bar for leaders or individuals who have high emotional intelligence, it's more around the 110 mark onwards. Then what it does is it shows how you have responded to the questions, Christy, and then the score for each of the competencies that I referenced in that graph, and then the individual or sub-competencies. So self-perception, then it rates the score, self-expression, and so on. So everyone will receive this report in a little bit of a different format. As I said, this is the group work report. Does that answer the first question you had?
It does, and it actually leads really nicely into Vanessa's question, which is, do you find it difficult to get people to be honest in a 360 review? I find people often aren't completely honest. So if I'm, going and filling this in, where does that play into it?
Very good question. First of all, one would hope that you've selected people that you trust and you know they will be honest in their assessment. Secondly, these assessment results are only yours. They are not shared with anyone. As the assessment or certified practitioner, I have an obligation to make sure that these results are only yours, and I cannot share it with Christy if it's from someone on Christy's team. So it's personal to you, and really one hopes that there is a truthfulness in responding. Having said that, of course, I may not like something that someone on my team has said, because you will see, if it was a direct report, a manager or others around you. And so there'll be some discussion around that. And part of the discussion or coaching could be, think through some things that may have resulted in that response, and or have a discussion with people. If, for example, if it's your direct manager, you know it's your direct manager, the report is going to show that. So that could be a basis for some open discussion. If it's feedback from a team, then that can be incorporated into a team meeting as part of your overall development. I feel that sometimes as leaders, we feel we have to know everything and be in control and not show our vulnerabilities. Our teams really appreciate it when we do show our vulnerabilities and that we're not perfect. And that also provides a trusting environment and creates a trusting environment.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, just that need as a leader to kind of, you know, to always be the cool, calm, and collected and to have the answers. And, you know, we talked at the beginning about, you know, kids in school, and it's the same thing, you know, as a parent, you know, you try not to lose your cool because, you know, in a stressful situation, it's the same thing, you know, at work, because people are looking to you for your reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, finding that balance between the vulnerability and the confidence.
Yeah. What I've also found through this year, particularly, is for leaders who do want to show vulnerability and say, I don't know, there have been times through the pandemic as leaders, perhaps, where you wouldn't want to be saying that because your employees also don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, there are times when your high emotional intelligence really would come into play in terms of when is the right time to say, I really don't know, I feel the way you do as well, versus pretending that everything is okay.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm. And if there was a guidebook on that, that would be amazing.
Maybe
question.
Yeah, question. Mm-hmm.
A question from Lisa. So how do we discern impulsiveness from a disruptor in a good way or entrepreneurial spirit? And I think this goes back, you know, this is sort of the perceptions of, and maybe this is a nice tie into sort of how men and women are perceived differently depending on, you know, the same behavior, but are they perceived differently?
So what was the question again, Chris? Impulsive.
How do we discern impulsiveness from a disruptor in a good way?
Yeah.
Or entrepreneurial spirit?
That's a good question. And I can't say I know exactly the answer because it really is the context. One can be impulsive and make the right decisions. That works out well. One can be impulsive and make the wrong decisions. And the same thing with disruptor. We know there are disruptors who disrupt for good. Then there are also disruptors, and based on underlying behaviors, emotional self-awareness as an example, are they disrupting simply to be disruptive? So you know, I personally don't feel I can provide a straightforward answer because there's always more to that based on the context in which that is happening. I'm sure we've all worked in or been in situations where people are being difficult for the sake of being difficult because they want to be heard, right? That probably plays into low emotional self-awareness. So these competencies as well, they're not to be looked at independently. One plays with the other. So if I have low emotional intelligence on emotional self-awareness, and to use that example, and I am impulsive on my decision making, perhaps there's a probing that needs to happen between the two. So not sure if that quite answered the question, but hope it was somewhat.
Actually, the question was more of impulsiveness sounds a bit negative, but there's also this quick disruption, quick entrepreneurial spirit, like quick pivoting, quick decision making. So I just wanted to know if there's a way to discern between the two, that you're not caught in something that just labels something as, oh, that was too impulsive.
Thanks, Lisa, for that clarification. And I would say, one, we shouldn't label initially. It will be best served to look at the results in its entirety.
Good, thanks.
To discern what's driving the behavior, because you're right. It could well be from an entrepreneurial perspective, someone who's absolutely in the right space to be disruptive. So it's really not a one-off, is what the best message I can provide, in that everything needs to be viewed in a holistic way.
Thanks.
Okay, I have another question here from Nikki. So I imagine this would leave some people feeling vulnerable, and I definitely agree with that. I mean, there's some pretty personal feelings in here. Do you find this is the case? I'm interested in offering this to my team, but unsure if it's workplace appropriate if anyone needs time to self-care afterwards.
Thanks for the question. And I've only used it in the workplace. And yes, it is sensitive because it's personal, but the first report we provide would be on how you've assessed yourself. So yes, I've had two approaches. I've had one individual with very high emotional intelligence. And so one could assume that it would be a very easy conversation to have. And it was. However, there were certain pieces that the individual could still develop and focus on. The other instance, I would say it was someone who did not have as high emotional intelligence as individual number one, and actually said, I disagree with the results. And I disagree with part of it. So as a practitioner and coaching an individual in that type of situation, it really would be asking very specific probing questions. And I actually ended up having the person then agree with what they initially disagreed with, because I was able to pick up threads through the conversation that got them to see how the piece that they disagreed with actually could play out. And this was, as I said, the person's individual assessment. It wasn't even a 360, because that's where more discussion can happen around, well, I disagree. The other part of Nikki's question was around health or well-being of an individual. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I'm so interested in offering to the team, but unsure if it's workplace appropriate. So if anyone needs time to self-care afterwards.
And can you clarify what you mean by self-care, Nikki?
I've encountered several individuals where when they feel shocked or potentially disrupted because they have to look inwards, they often find that they need to go and either isolate or take a walk or cry a little bit because they don't normally look at those emotions.
Mhm.
And I just didn't know how to navigate that situation if that were to arise.
That's a very, very good point. I have not experienced that yet. So what I will say, though, as I work through the debrief with someone from a coaching perspective, if I feel that someone is really taken aback, because you're right, not many of us go deep. We stay on the surface level of the ocean and we don't go beneath the top layer. I would guide the individual in terms of some things for them to consider, be it, you're right, going for a walk, whatever is important for their emotional self-care and their mental well-being. It wouldn't be my place to come back to you, Nikki, and say, oh, Lisa had a challenge, pay attention. I would encourage Lisa to go to Nikki and say, I've done this, and specifically if it was paid for by the company, again, no need to discuss the results. I really need some time to digest. And actually, I think it's very important for all of us when we review the results, no matter how high our emotional intelligence scores are, it is worthwhile to take some time alone to digest the information, because there are things probably that will surprise all of us once we go this deep. And to add to that, this particular tool is governed by the Canadian Psychological Association. It's considered a level B assessment tool. So I have certain obligations around that from the emotional self-care. I hope that helped.
That helped very much. Thank you. I just wanted to know how deep it was and how it worked in the workplace. That was succinct and very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if anyone else has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I've got another one for you, Anthea. So I'm making an assumption that, let's say if you were to do an assessment, or someone were to do an assessment, then 2 years later do it again, you'd probably get different results just based on life experience and learning. So I guess my question is, how can, what tools are there to help me personally grow in my emotional intelligence? you know, whether it's a book or a website, a podcast, to help me become more emotionally intelligent, more self-aware?
Mm.
Where would I start?
So it's a multifaceted answer to that question. The first
Sorry.
thing, one would hope the results are different 2 years on, like not only from life experiences, but how committed was someone to taking the results and going deeper and actually focusing on developing components of the emotional intelligence. That would be number one. So one hopes that it would be different. Number two, in terms of podcasts and books, I would say it depends on the conversation I'm having with the individual and what I hear are some of their interests. I would guide based on that particular area. So if I'm working with someone and impulse control may be an issue that not an issue, an area that they need to focus on, there could be some books that I would recommend. And I find that it really has to be pertinent to the individual and the particular area that they're looking to focus on versus general. I can provide lots of things to read and podcasts to listen to because that's what I do a lot of, but it really will depend. I would quickly just go through this next piece. I touched on this well-being indicator. I didn't go into detail about it. Oh, just excuse me. So the well-being indicator will take these 4 components of your assessment: your self-regard, your optimism, your interpersonal relationships, and your self-actualization. And they measure that as part of the well-being indicator. And as it states right at the top, the happiness component is different than the other EI abilities because your happiness contributes to your emotional intelligence and is also a product of your emotional intelligence. And so these subscales tie into happiness. It will share on an individual basis where you may want to focus on certain things. I remember my coach asking me, so what do you do for fun, Anthea? And I had to think about that. And I said, well, I guess I don't do a lot of things for fun, but I am happy. So that's the piece on the well-being indicator. And then there's a section called Balancing EI. And on the individual report for each of these, and I hope I'm not giving anyone a headache by scrolling through, but for each one of these sub-competencies and competencies, there's going to be a balancing EI. So it will speak to particular components that are high versus low and how you can balance it. And just looking at this one, this person's EI on problem solving is low and the impulse control is high. So they are able to take a look at, well, how do I focus more on finding quality solutions when my emotions are involved? And so if I just slowly scroll down to the next piece, it will tell you, and let's see if I can get to the one I just spoke about on impulse control. Close your eyes if you get dizzy, folks. I'll tell you when I get there, because I do know that's a challenge. Here we go. So this section here on flexibility will share with you that my flexibility of 113 is higher than my problem solving. So my inclination is to be more flexible, which may at times lead me to reflect or hesitate when making decisions, the problem solving component. So that's what the report also provides, how to balance your emotional intelligence between the main competency and the sub-competency. So yeah, your flexibility is in balance with your impulse control. So that's not an area to focus on because you have the same level of emotional intelligence around controlling your impulses and how flexible you are.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions that anyone wanted to bring up? It's funny. So I have 2 kids. They are 10, and my older one just turned 12 on the weekend. And we talk about feelings a lot in my house. And basically, it comes down to feelings are messy and they're complicated.
Yes.
And I mean, this certainly backs it up. But I think just that awareness, that self-awareness,
Right.
is helpful.
Exactly. And when someone says, well, I disagree with that result, what I can do as a coach as part of my report, is go to the questions that are assigned to each of those competencies and say, well, you've rated yourself this way to this question that aligns with a self-regard, as an example. Does that make sense to you? And it's interesting because one finds that initially you say, yes, that's exactly right. And then when you probe a little bit further and say, oh, well, yeah, maybe, I can see how or why I rated myself that way. So while it's a snapshot to begin with, the real jewel of it comes in with the discussion component when one goes a little bit deeper into various areas. And on the individual report, the first, second, third page for the individual, it shows what their 3 highest scores were and their 3 lowest. And then we ask people to validate, does that make sense to you? Does anything feel out of whack? And then we start the discussion from there. Any other questions?
So Vanessa just put a comment in there that, so Vanessa, she's the CHRO at Maple Lodge Farms. And so she's used this tool with great results. It's one of the best, which is awesome. So you got Vanessa's stamp of approval.
Yeah. I know we've not met formally, Vanessa, but high regard for you and the work you do.
Okay, any other questions about Anthea's presentation? So if you can actually send me your presentation, Anthea, what I'll do is I will make sure it's posted to the website so everyone has access to it.
Can I stop sharing now? And
You sure can, yeah. Okay. Did you have any closing remarks, Anthea, before I take over again? I don't want to cut you off. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, it's right. I just muted myself. No, I appreciate you asking. You're such a respectful woman. Thank you is what I'd like to say for the opportunity to present today to the group. I hope there was one nugget that you can walk away from, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. So I appreciate that, Anthea. We have some time left this morning. So I just, let's, you know what, I'm going to break us into groups. Is everyone okay with that?